one of the things that we really learned was the importance of the dining table as a communal locus in terms of bringing people together, checking in, making sure everyone's doing well, as well as sort of the value and ritual of breaking bread in space and how important a ritual that was in terms of tying you back to home, as well as connecting you to each other.
In this episode of The Bomb, Engineering a Path Forward, I'm going to ask you to think about a rather futurist question. What does daily life look like in space? Sure, we have the Hollywood version of life amongst the stars. Star Wars, Dune, and even cult classics like Alien give us a glimpse into the possibilities. However, these are far from the reality of what it's like to gather around and break bread in zero gravity. The guest of this episode aims to answer this question. Sana Sharma is the co-founder and chief design officer at the Aurelia Institute, a nonprofit space architecture R&D lab, and she's committed to two fundamental ideas for the future. One is that people will be spending more and more time in space, and the second idea is that the public should have access to research regarding space travel. Today, Sana's going to give us an inside look into the incredible research she and her team have conducted into the ways that astronauts live their daily lives while on missions in the final frontier, how advanced technology doesn't have to exclude the human factor, and how she hopes her research will change the future of space exploration with open source information at the forefront. This is my conversation with Sana Sharma, and this is The Bomb. We live in a time where design and technology touch every aspect of our lives. But where did it all come from? Who designed it? How was it built and brought to market? What will it look like in a year, 2 years, 100 years? From the phones and smartwatches that help us in our day-to-day to the cutting-edge spaceships and 3D printers that are leading us into the future, modern design is constantly shaping the way we work, communicate, problem solve, and play. And every new design, big or small, starts with an idea and a bill of materials. I'm Magenta Strongheart, and this is The Bomb, where we talk to leading innovators in the tech world and celebrate the transformational power of design. Thanks so much, Sana, for joining us on The Bomb today. Really excited to learn more about your work you're doing in architecture and design for space, which honestly, I have very little understanding around. So I'm very genuinely curious to learn from you and your background and what your latest projects are today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Awesome. So I think it'd be interesting just to start a little bit with your background and how you got into this work. In a little bit of my research before, I learned that you study architecture and design at Yale and Harvard, and then started working at IBM and then got into MIT Media Lab. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the journey and how you first got interested, even if it was before kind of formal education, interested in design and architecture.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a circuitous path to where I am today, but it's been a fun one for sure. I initially, when starting off school, wanted to be a physicist, and I love physics and astronomy. I have for a very, very long time. I actually met my co-founder and CEO, Ariel Ekblad, in first year of physics in undergrad. She stuck it out with a physics degree, but I ended up getting persuaded and pulled over to architecture and design. And from there, I've spent most of my career working as an emerging technologies designer more broadly. What I mean by that is that I'm a designer who knows just enough science to be dangerous, or enjoys sort of science and technical problems, and working with engineers and researchers to help sort of find the human element in what they do. And share that with a broad audience. And so went to school for that, spent a good number of years at IBM Research working on their quantum computing and generative AI teams, again, trying to find those human stories, as well as try to make some of those technologies more accessible for an audience of folks who maybe don't have PhDs in something like quantum information science. And then went back to graduate school, where I got pulled into the MIT Space Exploration Initiative, where Ariel was director. We collaborated on some research while I was working there, had the great privilege of working with and interviewing astronauts and cosmonauts and spaceflight participants to learn a little bit more about what the day-to-day life of space is like outside sort of the parameters of the mission. And after a couple of years of working with Ariel at MIT SEI, the initiative, she had this idea of spinning out the nonprofit Aurelia Institute, focused on space architecture R&D with the sort of education and policy background, as sort of forming a 3-pillar approach. And we had a chat where it sounded like a really fantastic opportunity to sort of push what we can do from both sort of a technical as well as a human-centered perspective on space and architectural design.
That's an incredible kind of convergence of a lot of different disciplines and I feel like projects and research that you are doing. And I feel like I could dive into any one of those kind of lanes deeper. I'm already thinking of a million different questions. But before we get further into kind of the current project, I'm curious if do you have any examples of like the most interesting things you learned during this? Was it the ethnography project?
Yeah.
In the when you were doing the research around day-to-day life in space, what were some of the most surprising things?
The astronaut ethnography project was a really fantastic opportunity for us, both at MIT SEI, the initiative based out of the Media Lab, as well as informing some of the work we've done at Aurelia Institute itself. We started off with this sort of basic question when it comes to learning from astronauts. We know a lot about astronaut health. We understand sort of what mission parameters are like. But we were really interested in whether or not there were sort of deeper experiential or maybe even cultural insights to be gained from astronauts, and whether or not they could be beneficial in envisioning and realizing what sort of the future of life in space could look like. Can we learn from the culture of the ISS right now in order to envision a future of what life in space might look like moving forward? We had the tremendous privilege of interviewing folks who'd actually been to space and talking to them less about sort of the accomplishments of the mission, but more about what that daily life was like outside of it, from a sensory experience, from an individual experience, and from an interactive and a cultural experience as well. You have sort of diverse crews of people coming together and working on things in an environment that is familiar, but also pretty extreme and sometimes dangerous. And sort of that working relationship, that crew relationship becomes really important. And so we're very interested in what microgravity does to sort of day-to-day operations, sort of what it's like to learn to live and adjust in zero G, but also sort of what space culture might look like moving forward in terms of what we might be able to learn from people who've been to space thus far. And our goal has been to open source as much of that knowledge as we can in terms of the primary sources themselves, as well as some of the research we've done in terms of opportunity areas for designing novel things for space based on these human-centered ideas, as well as a series of design principles as a way of sharing what we've learned in a more actionable or practical way.
That's so interesting. So would you say it's kind of the idea is to build a library of resources essentially for future designers or people that are designing for the future in space and kind of thinking about what that's going to look like over the next, how would you say the timeline kind of is, like in the near future, over the next 10 years, 20 years? Is there even a limit? I mean, or it's kind of just, since it is in a way still the Wild West, thinking about all that's possible there?
There's so much to do. And it's a great question that we've actually evolved upon ourselves. When we first developed this project at SEI, our goal, we started small. Our goal was to help this cohort of students and faculty members and staff members who were all thinking about, well, what would it be like to design for zero G? Or what would it be like to design for space? Helping get them sort of anecdotal or experiential information about what that was like outside of the pretty sort of extremely informative, but fairly sort of productivity and survival focused research that's out there right now in terms of space health and sort of the functional aspects of working and living in space. As we sort of shared our work, we've written a couple of papers that we've brought to places like the International Astronautical Conference. We found that there were sort of alternative use cases that we wanted to sort of test out and see. One is the design and engineering community more broadly. So outside of the MIT community, can we put our work out on the internet and see if we can inspire other folks to sort of use some of these use cases as ways to design for maybe near or longer term spaceflight? We also had a really fantastic conversation with an astronaut about the work that we'd done, where they'd mentioned that this kind of tool or resource might be a worthwhile sort of reflective tool for folks who've been to space in terms of what they might want to know ahead of time, as well as like what's important to sort of share and codify and disseminate more broadly.
Like a survival guide.
Oh, I don't know if I'd go that far, but maybe
No.
sort of a daily sort of slice of life, so to speak, in terms of what some of those experiences are like that out there, as a way of sort of, sharing information about shared experiences, as well as things that maybe are sort of higher variance, where someone might experience something in one way and someone might experience something in another way because we prioritize different senses, or we have different cultural backgrounds, or we care about different things in orbit. Sort of keeping not only the high level ideas, but some of those sort of little nuggets that sometimes end up on sort of the cutting room floor, like what, taco night in space is like. Not necessarily the subject of a research paper yet, but in some cases, really fantastic design fodder when it comes to imagining maybe the future of dining in space or the idea of cultural exchange and connection.
And does most of this research, you mentioned a few papers, do you guys also have some of the interview like clips or recordings available as well for people to check out? Or is it primarily through your own documentation of primary resources?
So we have sort of two categories of research in this space. The first are the interviews themselves, which we have sort of pulled insights from, but haven't necessarily published fully. We find that, both for the IRB as well as for having sort of a conversation with folks about what life is like outside of the mission, that the format of the anonymous interview was helpful. And so we've sort of synthesized and aggregated insights from those specifically. But from the primary source accounts, which they're actually a tremendous amount, they're just sort of scattered across the internet and in physical repositories. Consolidating those together, those are much more identified or identifiable because they're folks sort of writing about their experiences and then sharing them in other contexts. And so we do have this mix of sort of anonymized insights in order to sort of facilitate candid conversations with folks, but still share things that are insightful, as well as these sort of transcripts and primary resources that we hope sort of flesh out some of the bigger picture that are available, but in some cases really hard to find.
Who do you feel is kind of the primary audience? I don't know about necessarily targeting versus like who have you, learned is actually using some of these resources? It sounds like initially, it started out working a lot with students and faculty to provide more of a foundation for them and thinking about futurist design thinking and that sort of thing. But how has it grown or how has it evolved to who you guys are really trying to serve here? Or is there a direct category or it's pretty broad?
I'd say it's pretty broad, but the sort of the spectrum that you've described covers a good chunk of it. We started out with that sort of design community within the Media Lab, have grown outside of that in terms of other sort of design and engineering practitioners. In a lot of way, what we're doing at Aurelia Institute is an interesting test case of how a resource like this might be valuable, in the sense of sort of trying to practice what we preach. Yeah.
Are you sort of a design consultancy, would you say, when it comes to Aurelia?
So Aurelia Institute, in terms of what we do, is mostly in-house R&D. And so our primary space, or our first space habitat concept called Tesserae, spun out of our CEO Ariel's PhD thesis at the Media Lab, and is this reconfigurable self-assembling space structure. And so that's the idea that we've been sort of carrying forward in terms of both the technical aspects of design as well as the interior and lived aspects of design, because this structure is going to be pretty sizable, much wider than your sort of cylindrical design that you see in spaces like the International Space Station. And so a lot of what we're doing in that case is using some of the research that's been done in an academic setting and saying, okay, if this is something we know about zero-G, how might we design the next generation of a space we'd want people to live in while experiencing microgravity to account for some of these things that we've learned? What is a sort of a personal or body related design artifact or object that we can create? What occurs at the scale of the station itself? What happens when you think about multiple stations together accreting to form a volume that serves a lot of different functions? It's much bigger that we've constructed.
And is this imagined for professional space travelers, expeditioners, or is it also imagining, a future with more space tourism or this kind of thing, or shorter term residence or something like that?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it's a big question in terms of how we envision life in space moving forward. As a space nonprofit, we're not building for sort of the next generation of commercial space stations. And there are a lot of companies right now working on that in conjunction with NASA and other space agencies. With our concepts right now, we're working at a series of different scales as well as a series of different timelines. And that might be the best way to describe it. In the nearest term, we've been working on spaceflight hardware that's about the size of my hand, maybe a little bit bigger. And developing that hardware such that we can test it in microgravity environments and in space. We've tested it on parabolic flights. We've had the great fortune of being able to send some of our hardware to the International Space Station to see the sort of self-assembly mechanism work in zero-G itself. And so that's sort of the very near term technical feasibility that work that we do. But in addition to that, there's sort of two other work streams for Tesserae that I think get at the question you're asking in terms of sort of nearer term use of a space like this, as well as envisioning that sort of like future life in space and what we might want a space like this to be able to facilitate a little bit further down the line. So we've recently, as of this January, actually worked and published a case study on Tesserae in terms of fleshing out not only the sort of technical requirements needed for this structure to exist in orbit in the near future, but also the interior and design requirements needed to support a small crew of individuals, either career astronauts or scientific researchers. Working in the use case we chose was around biology and biosciences, in support of NASA's current vision or push to imagine commercial use of low Earth orbit in the relative near term.
We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, Sana's going to explain how something as simple as the act of growing and preserving food in space is so integral to the human design of future space stations. Welcome back to The Bomb, Engineering a Path Forward. I'm your host, Magenta Strongheart. Before the break, you heard how the design aspect of something as simple as living quarters on a space station could impact the way that the future of space travel will function, and how NASA is taking a serious interest in Sana's work. Okay, wow. So again, I'm like so many different directions I could go. I'm like so many questions I have, but I'm going to try to focus it a little bit. You said one of the main focuses kind of this design is elaborating a little more on having like a sustainable food source, it sounds like, and dining for maybe longer term. It's so funny. It's like all relative, right? So I don't know exactly what longer term means there, but longer than missions so far, I imagine. And when it comes to that, could you give us is there any kind of like paint a picture you could do for us there? What that looks like, whatever you're willing to share. I'm sure folks can find more online. We'll definitely link, in the show notes, all the resources for people to check out things in more detail. But I'd love to have a little more of imagine what try to visualize it for myself even.
Absolutely. And there are some fun resources online that we can share as well. But this is actually a good thing in terms of connecting back to research that we did at the lab for the astronaut ethnography project. One of the things that we really learned was the importance of the dining table as a communal locus in terms of bringing people together, checking in, making sure everyone's doing well, as well as sort of the value and ritual of breaking bread in space, and how important a ritual that was in terms of tying you back to home, as well as connecting you to each other. And while for near-term case studies, we know that space is super limited, for this sort of longer-term vision of what life in space might be like, we wanted to sort of elaborate on that idea of not only the sort of science and biology behind growing food. One of the things we've been looking into is fermented foods in space as a way of preserving and generating sort of nutritious as well as really tasty and culturally important foods for consumption in space. But then designing and developing spaces to bring people together in order to share some of these things as well. So that might be the bite-sized version of that story we're trying to tell.
I love both of those examples and the ways that dining table and gathering around to break bread together, and this idea around the fermented foods, like the really practical functions of those, but also the kind of, I love when in a way you would think old school or things that have been around forever are still going to be so important in the future and still have a place, obviously, in what it seems, emerging tech or these ideas that sometimes seem very far away, or, oftentimes I think people just assume anything high tech is going to be less human and these types of things. But I love that that's bringing it back to no matter how foreign a concept of like eating in space sounds, we're still going to want a lot of the things that are comforting and have been, timeless in cultures all over the globe, So I think those are really beautiful examples. So thank you for sharing those.
Absolutely. I think you hit it on the head in the sense that like we're still human in space, and ways to sort of represent and share and connect with our humanity are incredibly important. But we get to do them in new ways, given the novelty and exciting possibilities of the environment that we're in. And that's the space we're very much playing in.
So I would love to hear more about any kind of current projects you're really excited about or the future of where this is all going and anything, as far as like what's next that you'd like to share with our community.
Well, it's been a big year. We're a little over 2 years old, and we've done a lot in a very short period of time, thanks to a really fantastic team. I really, really love working with. I'd say the big thrust of what we do as an organization is that R&D. And so we have had the opportunity to send some of our Tesserae flight hardware to the International Space Station, which was an extraordinary opportunity in terms of testing and vetting the technical side of what we do. And from the experiential side, we've been developing this Tesserae Pavilion, an exhibition, sort of an experience prototype that allows us to show at full scale what a space like this might be able to do and house. We've also been using that as a kind of research platform or prototype, mounting sort of experimental tiles is what we've been calling them, sort of functional systems that we can mount into our frame in order to test things like growing plants or maintaining fermented foods, or even sort of interior design and furniture and what that looks like as it's sort of mounted into that interior space. Designing for zero G has some interesting challenges to it. In some ways, there's a lot.
That was going to be my next question. Like, what does that really mean?
It's a really interesting space to work in. In some ways, there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. I think one of the easiest ways to think about it is, think about the space that you're in. In zero G, there isn't really sort of dead space and then ceiling. Everything is wall. Everything is active. And so the room that, you or I are in right now is in a lot of ways bigger than we'd conceive of it in 1G when you have access to all of it in 0G. But there are some challenges, particularly with like large 0G spaces. If you can't touch a wall and you stop moving, you can't swim your way to another wall. You're sort of there now. And we are interested in designing sort of multi-story and large-scale 0G spaces. And so how you get people to move around in a way that feels comfortable and effortless without sort of constraining them to sort of like, hamster sort of tubes or what have you. Can you build spaces that are grand or sublime or comfortable, but have them be designed in ways that sort of facilitate some of those things? There's also, I think, the challenges for us of like what we learn at different scales. We're building a 0G mockup in 1G. And so the terrestrial engineering problems we're dealing with to build a shape that's really well suited for microgravity, but is on Earth, is actually a non-trivial one. And so we spend a lot of time on terrestrial engineering as much as we do on the space stuff.
That's super interesting. And my mind's going like immediately visualizing ropes mounted to the walls kind of thing for people to guide themselves along, or different things like that, fixed string systems for the furniture, any accessories in the space. Are you guys getting as micro as those fixtures themselves, or is that something you'd use off the shelf, clamps that exist or things like that? Like, where would you say the most kind of play is happening, or is everything like nothing is off limits,
I think given that we're working on a bunch of different timescales, we do have the flexibility to explore things that we feel are really meaningful in terms of the mission and vision of the org, as well as the stories that we're telling with the spaces we're designing. For things like our case study, it is really grounded in reality in terms of, requirements for environmental control and life support system, the concept of operations, sort of your life cycle of your station is envisioned, trying to build out as robust and near term a vision for this structure as we can. For things like the exhibition prototype, we can start to play with things in terms of, we know what industry standard looks like right now, but are there ways to make that more comfortable, more accessible, more customizable or modular? Being able to experiment a little bit with like that, I think is a perk of the way that we work. And trying to iterate and test those ideas is a fun challenge, given that some things you can learn about terrestrially and some things you need to, put on a parabolic flight or experiment with in other ways in order to see if it works the way you think it's going to work in an environment like 0G.
Yeah, I can't imagine, honestly, the challenge of prototyping for one environment, in a totally different, like you said, in a space where you have gravity and you don't have that exact, environment to test in. I'm curious how much kind of simulation tools you guys are using, and if you're open to speaking to which tools specifically have been most useful in the process, because we, as a community of makers and designers and engineers, everyone loves their tools, loves to talk about kind of what, is their go-to. So I would imagine some things are very, similar to what a lot of engineers and mechanical designers are using, and I'm sure there's some that's a little out of our realm of the usual.
Yeah, that's fair. And I might sort of take that question in two parts. Like simulation is definitely part and parcel of how we work in terms of some of the terrestrial work, which is what I've had more of a hand in. We have been really fortunate to partner with Autodesk. We've been working at their Autodesk Technology Center in Boston in order to build some of these small and then large scale prototypes as part of their outside network. And we use a fair amount of Autodesk Fusion 360 in terms of sort of prototype and CAD. We have a fair number of architects on the team, and so you have a lot of Rhino users and folks who are familiar with that Rhino Grasshopper, as well as the assorted CAD and simulation technologies that integrate with those. We have a lot of people who come from different places, and they use different tool sets. And so oftentimes our goal is to try to figure out how to get people to talk together, how to get programs to talk together, how to get systems to make sense in context of one another at different scales and different levels of fidelity.
Always a challenge with interdisciplinary teams.
Always a challenge. And so a lot of what we do is incredibly iterative. Sometimes the best way to figure out something is to make a prototype of it and break it and see what we need in terms of performance. I'd say the other thing that I'd really love to highlight here, it goes part and parcel with the education program that we've been developing. We have a fair emphasis on being able to test what we do at different scales on events like parabolic flights. If you're familiar with vomit comets and their ability to simulate small chunks of microgravity, it's a good way for us to test how we think something is going to work, at least at a particular scale, if we design our experiments well, and vet whether or not it's going to perform as expected. And this is something we found tremendous value at, both at MIT as well as Aurelia. And it's featured pretty heavily in the educational offerings we provide as well. We've developed, as part of Aurelia Academy, what we've been calling our Horizon Zero Gravity program, that involves a project course on how to design, build, and test for zero-G that culminates in one of these parabolic flights, where we're able to pull together like a diverse cohort of students to take a project from sort of soup to nuts and then test it in an environment like that. Because for all the simulation that you do, for certain things, experiencing it is incredibly worthwhile, not only for your experimental results, but also for sort of from an embodied perspective, what you learn from being in that environment.
Definitely. Sounds like a super awesome opportunity. And is the student age range there, is that university level, or what's kind of the program designed for? Yeah,
we've had a pretty diverse group of folks actually in terms of participants. University level folks, some masters and PhD researchers, as well as a couple of groups that have been doing fantastic sort of professional research. One group we've worked with called Astro Access. They're very committed to bringing a more accessible ethos to the space environment in terms of having disabled individuals go to space. And they've been developing a series of really fantastic experiments, I think, in terms of demonstrating the ways in which we might be able to design with accessibility in mind when it comes to space environments and space-related technologies. So that's an example of maybe not sort of your traditional course environment, but developing a cohort that's testing a series of things in order to really sort of try to open that door to space as wide as we can manage.
Just a question that comes to mind as you're speaking on this. I don't know if this is something you guys are focused on directly, but I would imagine it impacts kind of some of the work you're doing. Are you familiar with kind of the statistics on what the like expected growth rate of kind of the space market is projected to be over the next, I don't even know, 10, 20, 50 years, like in thinking about this as a design track, a design education track, engineering track, et cetera? How many jobs do you see opening up, for example? Or, I must admit, a field I'm not really that familiar with. So
that's all
spinning
good.
with you.
No, that's all good. That's all good. And I will lean into my lack of expertise in terms of some of the like larger statistical numbers based on sort of my background in architecture and design. But what I can say is the ways in which we're working in terms of designing and building for space are changing pretty rapidly, given who is going to space and why. In the past, 2 decades alone, we've gone from predominantly supporting a very small class of the most resilient humans on Earth going to space predominantly for research, to supporting things like space tourism, supporting sort of more niche research cases, having private astronauts going through channels that aren't necessarily NASA in order to, or another space agency to get exposure to the space environment. And given all of these new diversity of factors, I think there's a fair opportunity to imagine sort of how the space workforce is going to change as a result, given that we are designing for different people with different levels of expertise from different backgrounds and going to space for different reasons. We do need to approach how we design and build differently. And so I think there is tremendous opportunity from an education perspective to think through, if you're interested in the field of space architecture, it's really going to take a village of pretty diverse folks in order to make something like this real. So there are a bunch of different avenues that you may come through in order to participate in the ecosystem itself. Things are changing very quickly.
Totally. I feel like we've only really touched on this maybe with one of our other interviews. So I'm really excited for younger people, and well, not even necessarily younger people, anyone who's, curious and interested in this, to learn more about this as, a discipline to really explore and get into. Because I don't know if it's, really as obvious or comes to mind as an opportunity that's out there. But it sounds, like there really is an expansive opportunity there. As you may or may not know, open source hardware is a big part of kind of what we do here at Design Lab and with our family of kind of initiatives with Hackaday under the Supply Frame umbrella. And so I'd love to hear from you sort of why you guys value open source and why that's been a part of the mission and how you operate.
I think that's a fantastic question. And it's a challenging one in space. Given how space has traditionally worked, it's been a fairly closed environment. And some of that comes down to safety and security, which makes a lot of sense. Some of that comes down to sort of like expertise that's really hard to sort of transmit and pass on. But given that inflection point that we're at in terms of the ways in which we're designing and building for space changing, I think there's a lot of opportunity to open the doors to who gets to have a voice and who gets to contribute to environments like this. That's the change that I'd like to see. And so at least from a design perspective, it's something that we've cared about on the MIT side. It's something that we care about on the Aurelia side. How can we share sort of the possibilities of what we might be able to design and build and invite more people to participate in some of those conversations, to participate in some of those design activities? Given that we are sort of envisioning a future that we're hoping to have more people included into, having those voices as part of the design process is incredibly important. And so I think that's a lot of what motivates us in terms of trying to make accessible a lot of what we've learned in order to broaden some of that access and build up sort of what we'd hope to see that future workforce and that future sort of space habitat pathway to look like.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. And I love that it really comes down to accessibility and kind of democratizing this discipline and huge area for opportunity. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Without further ado, we'll wrap up with some of our quicker questions here. What is your favorite part of your job? Like I said, I think that this is a career I've rarely thought of. And I think a lot of folks are probably like, their brains are just exploding with the possibilities. So I'd love to hear what your favorite part is.
I feel extremely fortunate to have the job that I have. And I think if you'd asked me sort of envisioning this moving forward, I think the idea of being able to work on sort of physics, anthropology, and architecture, which were the three things I was really excited about starting school, has been incredibly fruitful and incredibly exciting. But if I'm honest, and it is the kitschy answer, but I will be honest here, the thing that I love most about my job is the team. We started off fairly small. I was design hire number one. The engineering work started off with me and our CEO and a design engineer. And starting from that point where all of us were doing just about everything, we machined a lot of our structure by hand. We were doing any work that needed to be done. Everyone had a hand on the football. Going from that small team and building together a group of incredibly fantastic, incredibly talented people who are all incredibly willing to try new things and to experiment and push sort of what their traditional disciplines would have brought them to do has been so fruitful and so exciting and has made our work so much stronger. And they're all lovely people as well. I've been really proud of the team culture that we've been able to craft. So definitely the people that we've been able to bring to the table feels very much like in a microcosm of some of what we believe in as an org in terms of bringing diverse perspectives to the table in order to build something greater than you can do individually.
Yeah, that's super beautiful. And I can totally relate to kind of the special experience of getting to grow something and be there kind of from the beginning. When it's a few people, it's a lean machine, and then getting to really scale and be a part of building that kind of family within the work you're doing. And yeah, that's awesome. So that's great to hear. What is something outside of technology that's inspiring you right now?
That's a fair question. So I've just moved to Seattle from the East Coast. And so I think the thing that has been sort of top of mind, non-technology related, has been the nature out here. I grew up in the Boston area. And so the idea that I can, walk from my house to the grocery store and on a clear day see Mount Rainier is mind boggling to me, is awe inspiring to me. And so I've been incredibly excited to get out into the natural world outside of Seattle and explore. But that new environment has been incredibly invigorating as I've been learning a little bit more about my new home.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing like switching up the scenery to really like be re-inspired. And
it's magical. Like, we don't have mountains like that on the East Coast. It's genuinely, it is so confusing and awe-inspiring.
Yeah, very much like larger than life
Truly.
feeling, kind of walking around mountains like that. Absolutely. All right. And last but not least, what's on your personal bill of materials?
Ooh, that is a good question. And I spend a lot of time thinking about bill of materials for my job. But personally, given that I've just moved, the thing that I'm working on right now is building out my little personal workshop at home. Now that I'm here, I spend a lot of time on the computer and on meetings. And so I like to make sure that I have a little bit of time every day to build with my hands and do something either for the home or for work or for a personal project. And so have on my list a couple of woodworking tools in terms of orbital and jigsaws. If this is a dream scenario, it is getting a desktop laser cutter and a 3D printer so that I can do a little bit more sort of parametric and CAD-based design and building.
Awesome.
But yeah, just building out that shop so that I can prototype in person as well as sort of work digitally.
Very cool. Love that answer too. Near and dear to my heart. I'm always dreaming about what my personal wood shop is going to be when I have the space and the budget to build it out. So happy for you that you're getting to make that happen.
It's very small, but it's the dream.
And I totally understand how that can make, the work-life balance and everything in between that much better. So that's great. Well, thank you so much. Like I said, my mind is just spinning with so many more questions and things, but we'll have to wrap it up here. I'm going to go on like a total rabbit hole deep dive into the website and all of the resources you guys have available, and definitely going to follow up more in the future. I'm already thinking about how we might be able to tap one of you or your team to speak at one of our conferences. I think that this is only the beginning of, how much I'm sure our community wants to learn from you all and what you're doing. It's really interesting, exciting stuff, and appreciate your patience and your insights and willingness to be here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. I really, really enjoyed chatting with you today.
That was Sana Sharma, the co-founder and chief design officer at the Aurelia Institute. Her vision for space travel offers a lot of hope for the future to keep the human element at the core of futuristic design and technology. This has been The Bomb, Engineering a Path Forward. If you like The Bomb, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow Supplyframe and Hackaday on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Design Lab at Supplyframe Design Lab on Instagram and Twitter. The Bomb is a Supplyframe podcast produced by me, Magenta Strongheart, and Ryan Tillotson, written by Maggie Bowles and edited by Daniel Ferreira. Theme music is by Anna Hogbin, show art by Thomas Schneider, special thanks to Giovanni Salinas, Bruce Dominguez, Thomas Woodward, Jin Kumar, Jordan Clark, the entire Supplyframe team, and you, our wonderful listeners. I'm your host, Magenta Strongheart. See you next week.